Hello, beautiful community. If you are following my analysis or pretty much anybody else's analysis who has got monitors still connected to planet Earth, you would not be surprised by the detainment of Mr. Girkin with criminal charges brought against him. He was taken away this morning. His partner says she hasn't heard from him since, and we're going to look at a couple of egregious things vis-a-vis the Kremlin that he said recently, but we'll understand that that wasn't the cause of why Mr. Gherkin has been taken away. So before we break it down, if you were going to be here just for 2 minutes, what the hell happened? I think two projects clashed. Mr. Girkin's project of formalization of his power via defiance. And we've talked unoriginally about this pattern because this pattern, I think, was first picked out by the Russian commentator Mr. Pastukhov, a wonderful commentator on Russian politics. But what Mr. Pastukhov has been saying is that there's a weird trend for people with a lot of informal power to try to formalize their power, right? And that sort of note was sounded by quite a few people around the time when one of the Kovalchuk brothers joined the Security Council, Putin's Security Council. And actually, Mr. Girkin too was in a kind of enterprise of formalization, only his enterprise was weird. He wanted to formalize power via defiance. And at some point put himself in a strong enough position with a sufficient degree of organic support to cut some kind of a deal and perhaps get a cushy seat in the Russian Duma or something of that sort. So he wanted to exchange his anti-MOD, anti-Kremlin rhetoric for something more formalized and cushy in the future. One project. The second project is Kremlin's crisis and Kremlin's panic over their loss of the monopoly over organized violence. I mean, it is important to acknowledge that Prigozhin's mutiny did not aim at removing Putin from power, but it was aimed at Putin. Right? Because if somebody says, no, he wasn't attacking Putin at all, this was just at Shoigu, well, who put Shoigu in place, right? So it was aimed at Mr. Putin, but it wasn't with a view to getting rid of Putin, it was with a view to a renegotiation with Putin. But just visualize again, what it felt like, and this is what a lot of people, who hate the Putin regime who are in Moscow also sort of reported. An armed column shooting stuff down, heading toward Moscow, without any clarity, right, by folks in Moscow that it would be stopped, or that it could be stopped. So that's just as an image, utterly radical, utterly extreme. Oh my word, what a complete catastrophe at the level of loss of monopoly of organized violence, something which is anyway a pattern and with many factors that are in place that we often discuss that will inevitably tilt that pattern, to keep rolling on. So Mr. Prigozhin's mutiny generated a situation where radical criticism of the MOD, radical criticism of Shoigu, and to a lesser extent Gerasimov, generated a mutiny that almost sort of convulsed into a revolutionary situation, right? So now we need to take a very different attitude to this kind of radical criticism. Otherwise, we could have more such situations, right? So the Kremlin's need to rebalance various kinds of ongoing conflicts with a view to stabilizing its odds of retaining decent monopoly over organized violence versus Mr. Girkin's self-aggrandizing plan to cushify himself via ventilating venom at the Kremlin. Let's break this down properly now. I want to tell you what, in my translation, Mr. Girkin came up with on his Instagram, but I don't want you to freak out about it as though that caused the arrest. He'd already been in trouble with some of his activities in Russia in recent days, and it weren't looking good since the Prigozhin mutiny. So this isn't what got him there, but these sentiments are maybe even a little further than how far he'd gone before. I am forced to I have to regret that Mr. Putin isn't a woman, Mr. Prigozhin wrote on the 18th of July. A woman, unlike Mr. Putin, a woman with weak character, not much of a brain. So he has got fiendish levels of anti-Semitism and chauvinism, Mr. Gherkin has. A woman with weak character and not much of a brain could have at least developed some talented favorites in her court who could have exercised power constructively, something Mr. Putin can't do. That too, of course, would have been a matter of luck, but there was always a chance. And Ms. Kabaeva didn't have the chops to take up that role. So here is Prigozhin digging into Putin's private life, which is a no-no, and talking about Putin being a woman. Now, none of what we're going to read is what did it. But, I mean, this is fascinating to watch, because this is Mr. Girkin trying to push his stuff to the very line without going over. And, of course, he's gone over when he's fallen down the cliff. Gets worse. For 23 years, we're still 18th July on his Telegram channel, which is sensationally viral. He's desperate to be here. He is in love with YouTube, but every account he's tried to get going has been immediately blocked by Google. But he is in love. He wants to be on YouTube. He's very jealous of us here. Let's see. For 23 years, a non-entity was at the head of the country, who managed to throw dust in the eyes of a significant part of the population. Now, this non-entity is the last islet of legitimacy and stability of the state. If we had perceived legitimacy, then actually it's a very good political analysis from Mr. Gherkin, because as we'll see, Mr. Putin is the sort of only political institution in the country with perceived legitimacy. Then he talks about how good it might be to hack this non-entity out of its place by illegal means. And then he says, but the country will not survive another 6 years in power with this cowardly mediocrity, Mr. Putin. And the only thing he could do usefully before the end, so as not to cover his name with the internal shame in history like Gorby, the anti-Semitic insult, insert it. The only thing he could do is to ensure a transfer of power to somebody truly capable and responsible, unlike him. So, no, this is not why Mr. Gherkin has been arrested, but this is quite close to being as far as he'd gone. So his rhetoric maybe did slightly increase. Now, I'm going to go through several points here. The first point is about Gherkin's organicity. Now, what pissed people off in the Z radical circles about Gherkin was that, I mean, he really did go with this sort of, as well as being sort of bathed in blood and war crimes legally and morally speaking, he did also come with this almost naive, fantastical, seraphic vision of Russia's imperial rebirth. And that stuff is real. He really loved to masturbate over this stuff a lot. And it was terribly, terribly exercised by it. And therefore, all of these Z voices who were paid to do what they were doing, who were ordered to release one kind of a message rather than another, were very jealous of the degree of independence of Mr. Gherkin, because Mr. Gherkin was really, able to put in not all, but a lot of the sincerity he had into his communication. And people felt resentful about that. There's a lot of people in Russia who are peddling the Kremlin line, who know that if they stopped, they just wouldn't be able to do anything in public, even if they could survive in private. Now, a member of the beautiful community raised a really helpful question the other day about why I potentially overestimated and mistimed the way I judged Prigozhin versus Girkin in terms of their reach for demographic, bubbles in Russia, various kinds of support among the population. Because I kept saying for a period of a few months that Girkin was a more organic figure than Prigozhin. I think that's still true. But I think Girkin's organic reach ever since 2014, about which we'll say more in a moment, was decreasing. And Prigozhin was on the way up. And I think that it's not why you're here, right? This is not my professional responsibility to get these details right. But I think in some of my commentary, I mistimed that trajectory. And I was understating on Prigozhin and a little bit overstating on Girkin. But nevertheless, it's true that he genuinely had this very, very profound organic reach, the kind that Prigozhin never did, but that was in decline. Now, let's not, having said something about his organicity, let's say something about his crimes. Now, in a certain sense, in a perfect world, Girkin wouldn't have been there to act as a kind of a instigating spark in Russia's war against Ukraine in 2014, because he may have not been a free man if he had been properly tried for the ghastly activities he was engaged in Chechnya in the late 90s and so on. And we're talking about Girkin's potential role in cleansing, in the disappearance of people and so on. So in an ideal world, the guy may not have been around, but we don't live in an ideal world. Of course, he is also guilty from the vantage point of a Dutch court, and he shouldn't be a free man. And we're talking about numbers here. Ethically, numbers always matter, right? So, insofar as he is responsible for MH17, we're talking, again, almost 300 lives being lost. So I don't want to milk this, but I just want to be aware that for all of our jokes, this is a guy bathed in blood, bathed in moral and legal crimes of various kinds. So he had a kind of a bonus status, right? And that's to do with his quote-unquote heroic role in 2014. That's to do, which is a big bonus for the Kremlin, with him being wanted by The Hague and him being found guilty by The Hague. And it's to do with some level of curation from the FSB, but that's also compatible with some folks in the FSB being increasingly unhappy with Mr. Gherkin recently. So what changed? This bonus role was becoming shaky, but in particular, it got shaken, as we just described, by the Prigozhin mutiny. And I don't want to over speak on this because this is how we began this video, but it really is the case that at this point, Mr. Girkin may well be a free man, not detained, if Mr. Prigozhin hadn't done the mutiny. Right? That led to an urgent reevaluation of how the Kremlin handles all of these quarrels, tensions, conflicts, ventilations. And there had to be inevitably a practical expression of the deep anxiety of the loss of monopoly over organized violence. So any criticism of the MOD felt suddenly much more existential than it was before. Of course, the MOD is a central beneficiary and now of the Prigozhin mutiny, and now it has increased capacity to engage in repressions. We still believe that there's going to be a limit to how far these repressions go, but nevertheless, for now, the MOD has a little bit of sort of a runway ahead of it through which it can travel, repressing those who were in various ways pillaring it. On Girkin's own intention, we've already put it on the table. I think he probably wanted a formalization of power. He probably would have loved a seat in the Duma. That is certainly what people around him seemed to be talking about and implying. My final remarks now on all of this. I mean, there is a kind of irony that the guy who sparked forward Russia's war with Ukraine in 2014 is almost a decade later, now that this war is full scale, now this war is going badly, has become himself a victim of the regime's prosecution, the regime's handling of the war. We've said many times that the main opposition to Putin this year was going to be from the Z radical side, from the pro-victory side. We've always talked about this business of people who want not just the war Putin is doing, but a more successful version of it. That's not going to go away, but there's going to be more anxiety and more preemptive action by the Kremlin to try to bring it about that these sentiments don't get too out of control, but that still remains the main thing forcing the Kremlin to look over its shoulder. The crisis of the monopoly over organized violence will deepen in Russia irreversibly. The only somewhat implausible way it could stabilize is if there is a series of successfully enacted totalitarian turns and a much more thoroughgoing fascization of the population, which for now remains radically depoliticized. Part of what the Kremlin is doing now is about looking forward to potential mobilization, maybe in the autumn, another wave of mobilization. And one of the other things we're on the lookout for that could have actually some significant political repercussions is the potential reintroduction of the death penalty in the near future in Russia. in the last few weeks, it's become clear that Mr. Putin has lost his aura of perceived legitimacy to some extent, and that fracture is irreversible. And we have to follow how that develops. And when we say that he's lost that, we're not talking about how various kinds of people in his court feel. We're also talking about perception in the population. Now, what folks feel is, of course, to be understood only once you grasp what it really means for a population to be radically depoliticized, not really to have a public opinion, to have just private opinions. So it's not going to be the case that people are sitting around and coherently debating being pro-war or against the war. Not at all. That rarely happens, except in these either sort of liberal democratic anti-war bubbles or in the Z-radical bubbles. But the majority of the Russian folks in the middle will just have sort of vague feelings about how maybe things are not as normal as they had seemed, how Kremlin's attempts to normalize the situation are not persuasive, and how maybe we've reached a stage where Mr. Putin is no longer able to fix things, that we can no longer say that, while we don't understand what's happening, our inferred sort of picture of justification for Mr. Putin's action still works. That's to say, yes, this war looks crazy, but surely he must have some good reasons for it, even though we don't know what those are. Now there is more room than ever for feeling that, well, we don't know that either. We don't actually know anymore whether Mr. Putin has good reasons or not. He might, but maybe he doesn't. And that's a shift that over the last few months, in my opinion, has gone further. And then there is the perception that whatever problems arise, generated by the regime or by some kind of enemies abroad, as people might perceive those, that it's not necessarily the case that Mr. Putin has got it covered, that Mr. Putin's got it under control. He may not. And whether he does or whether he doesn't is something we can't even know. But the suspicion that he might not is more readily available to the depoliticized blob in the middle in Russia. Lots of love talk very soon. Bye-bye.